Barriers. Barriers are broken all over the place, both figuratively and literally.
They're gonna break the sound barrier!
However, some barriers are less noticeable than others. Take Clair de Lune, for example. It was the first ever song recorded in history. This broke the barrier for the first taped song in music in 1890. Now, there are some more literal meanings to the word breaking barriers as well, such as when the Great Wall of China was breached by the Manchu king in 1644. Today, however, we'll be visiting Japan and taking a look at the first black samurai in recorded history, all the way back in the late 1500s.
Before 1616, Japan had been in a constant state of war. There were no centralized powers, just many warlords fighting to control Japan. This constant state of war was known as the Sengoku period. Japan had no central government, and many different powerful warlords were fighting to centralize power in Japan. One of these powerful warlords was known as Oda Nobunaga. He sought to unite all of Japan under his aristocratic rule. It was going to take a lot to succeed in uniting Japan. With that said, Oda Nobunaga did end up controlling half of the provinces in Japan with a stable government, with his absolute game changer, Yasuke.
Arriving to Japan on a Portuguese ship in 1579, Yasuke had been serving under a Jesuit named Alejandro Villagnano, who had been visiting Japan for silk and fabric trade. During this time period, Japan relied heavily on these imported items and even allowed the Portuguese men to build a trading port on the shore of southern Japan. The port came to be known as Nagasaki and quickly established a Catholic presence in the southern Japan. By the time the Portuguese had actually reached the latter, it had been a full 2 years until 1581 when Yasuke and Alejandro had reached the major city of Kyoto. At the time of their arrival, there was a lot of interest sparked throughout the city. The people of Kyoto were absolutely staggered by this stranger that had arrived. People piled on top of one another just to get a glimpse of him. There were even a number of cases where people were trampled to death by the uproar Yasuke had caused.
If you look at Japan's deep history, you can see that they are strong believers in outer-worldly beings, such as gods, monsters, spirits, and what have you. And to never have seen or even heard of an African before, it would come as no surprise that when Yasuke arrived it caused quite the commotion. People were absolutely stunned by Yasuke, especially due to his towering stature, who measured to be 6'5" tall. The average height for a fully grown male in Japan during the 1500s was around 5 feet. This meant that Yasuke was a full 1.5 feet taller than most adults at the time. Not only was he taller than everyone, but his monstrous strength was equal to that of 10 men combined. His skin was also much darker than anybody else in Japan had ever seen before. This drew attention from all over the city, and it didn't take long for the warlord Oda Nobunaga to learn of this strange man's arrival.
When word had reached Oda Nobunaga of the strange man's appearance, he had him escorted to the palace almost immediately. Many people believed this newcomer to be a demon or a god of some sort, even going as far to scrub him down to see if his skin was in fact his own. Oda Nobunaga saw Yasuke as a potential warrior after hearing of the past as a bodyguard for his Portuguese Jesuit. While he was serving under his Jesuit, Yasuke had no set name until he was given the name Yasuke by Oda Nobunaga, meaning the Black One.
He knew that Yasuke's height and firmness was already an advantage, but in order to turn him into a valuable warrior, Nobunaga had put him through serious training. In fact, Yasuke was so admired by Nobunaga that the warlord took it upon himself to personally train him in just a few months. This process would normally take most people years to complete. He was granted all the same privileges as any samurai in Japan. Nobunaga even bought him from the Portuguese to ensure his freedom. In the time, the two became great friends. They would share stories from each other's past and get along like old friends. Yasuke even learned Japanese with his time in Japan.
As time progressed, Yasuke was put on the front lines of combat, fighting fiercely against Oda Nobunaga's enemies. The main advantage that Nobunaga's forces gained was not only the fact that Yasuke practically towered over his enemies, but the people of Japan had never seen an African, let alone fought one. His adversaries believed him to be a demon, which evoked fear throughout the enemy forces, leading to easy victories in the war against opposing clans.
Now, becoming a samurai is no walk in the park. It begins at childhood typically, and it consists mostly of spiritual discipline, Japanese study, and martial arts. A samurai also must learn kendo, the way of the sword, although in earlier years they predominantly used a bow and arrow, only using their swords when up close. In the 13th century, when battles with the Mongols broke out, their fighting style was slightly changed and they made better use of their swords, spears, and naginatas. A common misconception is that the samurai fights were extremely fancy and drawn out, as seen in various movies and TV shows, but in reality, a samurai battle could end in a matter of seconds. A battle didn't consist of constant sword clashing, but instead constant moving until someone makes a mistake that will ultimately cost them their life.
Even with Yasuke's advantages over his enemies, the time he had with Oda Nobunaga was unfortunately cut short due to one of Oda Nobunaga's closest generals. No one was supposed to know the location of the hidden temple Oda Nobunaga had been at during the time, and with a poorly guarded bastion, Oda Nobunaga was a sitting duck. Even with Yasuke by his side, the battle was ultimately lost due to the enemy's sheer numbers. In the end, Oda Nobunaga was forced to commit seppuku. Yasuke was able to put up a fierce last stand before ultimately escaping after witnessing Oda Nobunaga meeting his end. Not long afterwards, Yasuke arrived to aid Nobunaga's son Oda Nobunata in battle against yet another ambush. Unfortunately, still wounded from his previous battle, Yasuke ultimately lost once more, leading to his capture. Even after this, Yasuke was granted his life as he was seen as not human. Eventually, in 1582, Yasuke adventured back to the Portuguese church in Nagasaki, where he was welcomed back with open arms. Even though Yasuke's tale is an interesting one, it is uncertain where his story goes from here. Most historians believe that Yasuke lived out his remaining days under the wing of the Portuguese Christians. However, Yasuke did leave behind quite the legacy, not only being the first black samurai, but also the first ever foreign one as well. After Yasuke's time in Japan, the once incredibly secluded country became more welcoming to foreigners, with the next foreign samurai arriving a short time later in 1592. Now, being the first black samurai is already an impressive enough accomplishment, but without Yasuke, Japan may have never been the same as it is now. If Yasuke hadn't fought on Oda Nobunaga's behalf, Japan may have never unified itself and could still be warring to this day for all we know.